Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Today, we are going to have a conversation about the media. What do we think about the media? What do we think about the media's role in politics and social policy? Do we think the media? Um, do we think that its role is far deeper than just cable news? Are there certain philosophical ideas or certain cultural ideas associated with the media, or does the media uh, does the media factor into our worldviews at all? Um, and to springboard the conversation, my co-host and I watched an old interview, Rachel Maddow, or an old interview between Rachel Maddow and Jon Stewart. Rachel Maddow was interviewing Jon Stewart on her show, and Jon Stewart for years has been known for his criticism of the media. And I thought it was I've seen the interview several times, and I just think it's a very interesting interview because you have someone like Rachel Maddow, who is part of the mainstream media, and then you have somebody else who is a political commentator of sorts, but also an outsider. He's not part of the mainstream media. He's a comedian. And he's just a comedian giving or talking about. He's someone who's talking about the news and politics comedically, but he also has a point of view, and it's not just for laughs. It's also to I guess in Stewart's mind, to make the world a better place. But anyway, I thought this was a worthwhile conversation because I think we both have negative opinions of the media, but I think we have negative opinions of the media for very different reasons, or our negative opinions stem from different, intuitions or different values. So I think that's a good introduction to what we're going to do here. I'd actually like to hear sort of your thoughts about the interview and any thoughts you have about the media first, and then I'll give you my 2 cents.
Yeah, so when you recommended we watch this video because you'd seen it a few times, and I guess this is the conversation we had was I reacted negatively because in my mind I'm hearing, oh, it's a TV pundit interviewing a character who helped proliferate comedic political commentary, and that makes me think of things like Trevor Noah and John Oliver and all that like. And I don't think any of them have contributed things that are particularly valuable, in the last decade. So I'm like, why? How could this be remotely valuable to inspect? But we hadn't talked about the media at all, and I figured I'd give it a shot because I shouldn't out of hand dismiss all of Matt's ideas. I guess that might be a little unfair to do, sometimes. So I watched it, and he does bring up interesting points, and at the worst, I guess the back and forth is interesting. And it's because a lot of the meta-analysis of the news you see coming from mainstream figures is very self-congratulatory. I'd mentioned to Matt that I listened to all of Brian Stelter's new book, Hoax, and it's pretty self-congratulatory about CNN's coverage and only really criticizes Fox. And they admit that they get things wrong, but it's kind of like, but we're not like them at all. And Jon Stewart is kind of willing to push back on those types of thoughts. So it ended up being an interesting conversation. I have some like main takeaways, but I think you might do a better job going through your mindset because I kind of want to know what jumps out to you and maybe it's so noteworthy to you because there are a couple points where I'm like, I like that, I agree with that sentiment, but I'm not sure what I think caught your attention. So let's go from there.
Alrighty, so I tossed the ball to you, and you're tossing it back to me. I see how it is. So I don't mind. I've seen quite a few Jon Stewart interviews actually, and most of them about his thoughts and feelings towards the media. He did an interesting interview with He's done several interviews with when Bill O'Reilly was still on the air. He did a really interesting interview with Chris Wallace. Of course, one of his most famous appearances is on the show, which is no longer on the air, called Firing Line. And I just find Stewart's position on the media to be very captivating and very persuasive at one level, because it's emblematic of sort of this neoliberal consensus. The premise of the mainstream media is going with is you have Democrats and you have Republicans, and the Democrats are the liberals and the Republicans are the conservatives, and then you're battling it out. They both have opinions. It's kind of a toss up between who's right or wrong, which is why you have one of each side on your show, and they battle it out or they talk about they use talking points for 5 minutes, and then the viewers left to, oh, what do you think? And the interviewer generally doesn't pick a side. Sometimes they do, of course, but generally it's like, well, okay, it's that they both have a point, or they're both legitimate positions to have. So you just the interviewer attempts to be impartial, or attempts to show both sides of every question. But of course, there's a deep flaw in that idea, in that when the media is, when you see these like little debates or little conversations with people from one on the left and one on the right on various issues, it's basically the media saying that everything's 50-50, basically. So it's like if you go on if you watch a certain news channel and they're debating climate change, okay, you have someone who believes in climate change and someone who doesn't believe in climate change, and then they talk about it for a certain length of time, and the interviewer interjects with a couple questions here and there, and they call it a night. But then there's the question of, well, on that particular issue, is there really a debate at all? So I think my criticisms of the media are that's a key part of it, is the media is misrepresenting certain ideological debates, and it is spreading, if you'll forgive the phrase, misinformation, or it is painting the narrative. The media paints certain narratives, and I think the narratives that they paint are almost always wrong, and they're wrong for all the reasons that the neoliberal consensus is wrong. I'll let you jump in here.
Yeah, so I totally agree on one of the huge problems of the media. It's the corporate press. It's generally overwhelmingly coming from the perspective of the neoliberal consensus. That was the phrase I was thinking of, and I'm glad you used it. So that has all the flaws that goes with it, and I think that sets up all the other problems. I don't really think pitting the far positions against each other is that bad, because we don't even see that as much anymore. I think the main problem of it is usually how short the segment is. So it is just pandering and talking points. So it's not, I don't find the issue of presenting an argument as an issue and making things seem maybe more even than they are. I really see the issue as it has no substance, because how much substance can you get about a 90-second exchange on climate policy, right? So I think those are just useless. I think it's noise. I don't think there's anything to be gained from it. So when we're talking about things like how Jon Stewart keeps bringing up how Fox News is ideological but not necessarily partisan, I think Fox News, well, I mean, the Fox News kind of has a rift between them and Trump to some extent. So some hosts are all in on Trump, and some specifically don't like Trump, even though they're ideologically closer to Trump than Biden. So you can argue that shows that's more ideological than partisan, because if they're partisan, then every single person would be clearly falling in line. I think the point is, though, is that bringing up the difference between ideological and partisan is what really shows its colors when you look at like CNN and MSNBC and just general news coverage, because they all operate by interpreting the information they report on, even when it's supposed to be unbiased, through the lens of the neoliberal preferences and ideologies. So when there's a story about why a Republican is blocking a stimulus package, it is almost always, unless it's coming from a specifically right-wing outlet, it's always going to have this tinge to it about how stimulus is a good thing. And it always has these little implications that that's inherently true. And I don't think that's a reportable statement, because I don't think that's true. I think that's an opinion based on their ideology. But it wouldn't even show up in like an opinion piece. It would show up in the reporting with the implication that these are the things that should be prioritized, because these are the things that neoliberals would prioritize. So I think that's one of the real follies of the news. And I think that's something that Jon Stewart bringing up, the ideological versus partisan nature, is important. Because a lot of times in the reporting, they won't be partisan, but they'll be ideological. And I think that's an issue. Okay. Did you freeze? Are you able to talk? Can you hear me still?
I can hear you.
I can't hear you. Okay, you're back.
Hello? Oh.
Okay, we can cut that part then. You're back now. I finished my thought and paused if you're able to jump in.
Yeah, I had a few things to say about what you said. I'll pause like 3 seconds. So I guess I would add the caveat to the first point you made, that I'm not necessarily against taking someone of one position and someone of the. I'm taking people from the extreme ends of certain issues and having them talk about it. I guess my point was more that there on certain issues, like I think certain things are just you're not really, if you think they're a debate, then you're just misinformed. There are certain things that are just so basic to if I may use certain buzzwords like truth or morality, that it seems absurd to me that we would debate them, and so I just think the media doesn't have a sense of when there are legitimate debates and when there are not legitimate debates. Everything is a debate from the perspective of the mainstream media. Now the second point you mentioned about the distinctions between partisan and ideological, I think that's an interesting perspective. At some level, you could say that ideology is not, or you can't escape ideology, or rather, everything is ideological at some level. But then there is the question of there's the question of can you, or how objective can you get in journalism? How objective can you get when you're reporting the news? How objective can you get when you're writing articles about the deficit or stimulus checks being blocked and whatnot? Because pure objectivity is impossible. But I don't think that means objectivity in journalism is completely. I don't think it's possible to be completely objective, but I don't think that means objectivity doesn't exist, if that makes sense. I think there are ways to for journalism to be as objective as possible while acknowledging the inherent subjectivity of politics. And I just don't think the mainstream media is concerned with that. As we both agree, the mainstream media perpetuates the ideology of, to use a buzzword from Tucker Carlson, the elites, the the philosophy, the worldviews of the elected leaders, and that really goes all the way from any outlet you can, any news outlet you can name: NPR, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, ABC, CBS, NBC. All of these outlets, that they represent the opinions, the spectrum of opinions of the rich and powerful. And that the differences come from the fact that obviously not all rich and powerful people believe in the same things. So yeah.
Yeah. So on the objectivity front, I'm one of those objectivity skeptics, but I would say that you can be more objective than other sources, right? So I don't think there is pure objectivity, but I think you can be relatively objective compared to other inflammatory sources. My issue isn't actually that they aren't objective enough, because I don't really have a preference of if they're objective. I like a lot of subjective news, and I think that actually is more beneficial than listening to things that try to put on a facade of objectivity, but then they miss it in little ways. I would rather things are kind of openly acknowledging their worldview and then reporting it. And then it's like, okay, I just listened to The Economist talk about this, but I know The Economist are neoliberal Keynesians, right? So it's like, I know that when I read this reporting, a lot of it is facts, but a lot of the things that are, in between the facts, the small things, all of those have these assumptions probably built into them. And it's like, this, but I've told you that I've been a listener of the Daily Wire for years. And as I've become more of as I became an ANCOM, and before that a libertarian, but before that essentially a constitutional conservative, or whatever you'd call like a Ben Shapiro type, it's like I've agreed with them steadily at a decreasing rate, but it doesn't mean that I don't like hearing their opinions on why things are right and wrong, right? I get a lot out of hearing why Ben Shapiro thinks something that happened is wrong. And it doesn't matter if I agree with him. He's just very representative of a certain line of thought based on a certain ideology. And I think that's very beneficial to understand. Now, if he pretended to be a news anchor and he toned down his rhetoric eightfold, but everything he was trying to communicate in his heart was towards the values he lives, then you're going to get different forms of messaging. But in the end, you might be able to uncover a similar ideology. So it's like I'd kind of rather them be out in front about it. And that's why I do find myself listening to a lot of heavily ideological news outlets, right? And I've told you that I listen to, sometimes I force myself to listen to Michael Moore talk on his podcast. Sometimes I listen to Pod Save America, another crooked media podcast. And it's because I think there's something there to be gained, even if it's just, oh, here's what people who share their partisanship or ideology, what are the things they're spouting right now. And it's not to take it as, oh, here's the objective truth. I kind of do think you need to hear the different arguments to get the brain start rolling, because sometimes you can't just hear, oh, this happened, and then have an intuition until you hear two different sides, or five different sides for that matter, argue about how you should react to it. So I don't think objectivity should even be the goal a lot of the time. I just think the issue is like if you had the Washington Post, the Washington Post saying democracy dies in darkness, and then putting on the facade of being objective. But then if you read the reporting, you're like, well, all these stories are the kinds of stories that neoliberal would cover, and they're covering them with those same assumptions. Then you're not being objective at all. And that's what a lot of people are led to believe. And that's why when I talk to a person who's a pretty standard Democrat, if my source isn't the New York Times to follow up a point I say, then my point's probably not going to be well received. And that's why I specifically know a lot of New York Times articles that back up points I have to say, because I know those are the only things that a lot of Democrats will listen to, right? Because that's kind of how our news has been polarized. And only certain things are viewed as trustworthy and objective, even if I wouldn't say the New York Times is objective. But some people believe that because that's the facade the New York Times put up. And 20 years ago, they were probably a lot more objective than they are now. So yeah, that's what sets me off on that front. If you want to close that door and move on from objectivity, that's fine. I'll let you get the last piece in on that front.
I'm not sure. We might be quibbling over words. We probably don't. I'm not sure if we disagree as much, or if we really disagree much at all, or if this really truly is like a fundamental difference between the two of us. I think the way I would describe this is what is the role of a journalist? What is the role of the news? Are there different kinds of journalists and different kinds of roles you could fill? I mean, that there is someone like a reporter who is solely focused on giving the facts and going to certain countries or certain events and just reporting what they see and interviewing people and writing up articles. There are opinion journalists and pundits, which earn a living by giving their perspective on certain cultural and political and social issues. So I think it's a question of are you, or is somebody, is a news outlet or is a person upfront about what they're doing? Are they masquerading as a reporter even though they're an opinion journalist, or are they upfront about, I am an opinion journalist, I'll give you the facts, but then I'm going to use my ideological philosophy to interpret those facts. I think that the mainstream media tends to blur the line between reporters and pundits. And to broaden out this conversation even further, I think that the part of my insistence on a certain level of objectivity in the news and in journalism comes from the fact that, and this is a pretty like old idea, the idea that journalists are in opposition to the government, or they have the press has an antagonistic relationship to the government. And that's exactly the kind of relationship that the press should have with the government. The people in the press and in the media need to scrupulously analyze what our elected leaders say, what they're doing, the kind of policies they're promoting, the kind of legislation they're trying to get passed, their voting record. Are they doing what they actually claim they were going to do, or are they hiding something? Are they corrupt? Or do they have $90,000 in their refrigerator? That this is the kind of thing that the press should be doing. And so that's part of the reason that I'm not willing to say, well, there's no objectivity in journalism at all. It's all subjective. Our elected leaders need to be held accountable by people who put in the time, do the research, and are able to say, okay, this politician said this, or said they believe this, this, and this, but in practice, this is what they're promoting, or this is what they're doing. Or this politician said this, and the facts just don't bear it out. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts on that, or if you want to move on to something else.
I think what you just said is kind of, it's moving on to a different branch of that conversation. And I think that's worth going down a little bit. So part of what I'm hearing is, in a way, there are branches of what it means to be in the media, right? So you open up the New York Times and, well, maybe that's a bad example because people say the reporting is biased, but, there's supposed to be a lot of reporting, and then eventually you get to the opinion section. But in the reporting section, you should be able to get hard facts about what's happening. But then there should also be people who are like, an investigative story should pop up in there every now and then. And then there should be stories about how people have contradicted themselves, almost like to some extent within reporting itself, you're kind of keeping people consistent. or at least the people who are doing the reporting would ask whoever the president is, no matter who the president is, hey, you said this last week, now you're saying this, why? And then you could report on that answer. So to some extent, it's like I agree that those branches are distinct and they all serve a role. And we've definitely seen a tectonic shift towards the opinion side as opposed to the investigative side or a nonpartisan, non-ideological side. If you compare the pressers for Trump and the way he's asked questions to the most recent presser for Biden, they are drastically different because it seems like the reporters aren't willing to ask Biden a lot of tough questions. And then Trump opens himself up to be asked a million tough questions because he just says things all the time, regardless of previous positions or consistency, right? So to some extent, yeah, it could be better if there was outlets that were willing to, I guess, non-ideologically investigate the people in power at all times. But right now you only get Project Veritas only investigating liberals, and then you only get the New York Times going out of their way to track down Trump's taxes. And you don't see a lot of people targeting their own team. And that's just the partisan nature. I don't know if I'm willing to argue that's a bad thing, because if you really want to be motivated and have motivated investigative journalists, then if you tie in the skin of the game of needing to get the other side, then I feel like that is motivating and you are more likely to find dirt that way. But in the end, after, I guess that's just some thoughts. I don't really have conclusions on that part. But my overall thought is I'm okay with the shifts in the media complex because the way people use media is how they want, right? So if more people are listening to Ben Shapiro and less people are reading reports about like the straight up news from like, I don't know, the Associated Press website, I'm kind of okay with that because Ben Shapiro does give some facts. He chooses the way he covers, and that's going to be ideological. But then he says something, and if those people just only want an hour of news a day and they'd rather hear an hour stream of consciousness spoken word op-ed from a neocon, then it's like that's fine. That serves their preferences, and it's like I like getting my news from a bunch of stuff that contradicts each other and then sussing it out. But I understand why a ton of people wouldn't want that. So I don't really think that there's a normative, way that it should be run. But I can see how there are issues or potential issues with how things are going. And those are things to keep our eyes on for another 10 years. Because in another 10 years, it might only be Project Veritas and a left-wing equivalent doing any investigative research. And then it's like, well, that's going to have implications on who's running for office and who's having scandals leaked and stuff like that. So there's definitely a shift that needs to be observed and recognized. I agree with that much.
I think this is why I was saying earlier, this could be just a fundamental difference between your worldview and my worldview, in the sense that I think it all boils down to, at some level, do you believe in something? And we don't, and I promise I won't go down this rabbit hole too much, but like, do you believe in the concept of truth, or does someone believe in the concept of truth, or do you believe objectivity is possible at all in any form or fashion? Because if one's going to go full postmodernist and be like, no, there's no truth, there's no objectivity, everything's subjective, then pretty much my whole argument falls apart. But I'm not full on. I don't go full postmodernist. So I think that there is a certain level of objectivity that I expect from journalists and people in the press and people in the media, even if their main shtick is giving opinions.
So remember back in the old days when we talked about the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debates, and we finally did the fourth one. But back in the old days when we did the first one, there was something I honed in on. It's still probably like one of my favorite things Jordan Peterson ever says. And you can argue it's a postmodernist thought, I guess. I haven't studied a lot of the postmodernist thinkers, and I know that a lot of people think they've been mischaracterized, so I'm not willing to touch if it's actually accurate. But Jordan Peterson pretty much says there are an infinite amount of facts in the world, and you need some sort of value structure to interpret them, or else you literally run into an infinite amount of information to characterize on pretty much everything. Because like if I look at the desk I'm recording this on, it's a black desk, but it's also not a white desk, and it's also not a green desk, and it's also not a yellow desk, right? So there's an infinite amount of information characterized by pretty much every statement, and we need some way to interpret it. So on like a big picture level, you can't be objective technically, because you have to say what things are worth covering in the news. Now, fortunately, we generally have, on average, similar values to some extent in terms of like, well, we think if you're in a pretty safe area, you probably think like the rare homicide should show up on your local news. So you're like, so people, if there were very few homicides in their neighborhood, would be like, well, that's worth covering, and that would be agreed upon by consensus. But certain town halls about certain random issues are only going to be important to 0.5% of the population that cares that now they can't let their dog off a leash when they walk down their street because of a new city ordinance, right? So maybe that won't get any play, but everybody agrees a homicide should. So it's like, how can you argue what is the correct one? And it's like, well, you can't, because there's a value structure, and everybody does have different things that affect them differently. And then I use the small example and the big example, but there's so many on the line things that come up every single day when it comes to policies and meetings and all this. So things that generally fall in line with the neoliberal consensus are what make the news. So that's like what I think inherently can make it ideological, which in turn carries its own bias, even when they are reporting the facts, right? So because they've chose stories that are based on their ideology. So I would argue that there's clearly an objective direction you can go, because you can work towards an idea that is like clearly less repulsive than somebody just screaming obscenities with no facts and only vaguely alluding to things that happen. So like you can be directionally more objective. It's just well, once we start talking about absolutes, that's the only time I get fuzzy on things and sound like a postmodernist, because it's just like, well, how can you be absolute when a reporter has to choose what they report on? And then that kind of decision is bound to be bogged down by certain types of ideals, and even if they're widely shared, they're still not objective ideals. So that I think that's the core thing that we appear to disagree on. But I think that's like the extent of my thoughts on it. It's like if you respond and criticize that, that's fine, but I probably won't have much more to say on it. I think that's the extent of the intuitions that are running up against each other with us.
Well, actually, it's interesting if you say we disagree, because hearing that, I think we agree. So maybe we disagree on whether we even agree, because it's all about everyone says everything's a spectrum. So forgive me, but I'm thinking of objectivity as a spectrum. Yeah, on the one side, it's completely subjective, or something's completely subjective supposedly, and the other side, something's completely objective. And I think there's a certain level of objectivity that journalists and the press and the media can arrive at. That's not to say that anyone has perfect knowledge. That's not to say that people's values or intuitions don't go into the journalistic process. But there's a way to there's a way to report on the news and report on politics, which I think allows for people to engage with the issues honestly. This is I'm going to go on a slight rant, but it's a relevant rant. I think one easy example as to why the mainstream media doesn't often engage honestly with the issues is how the mainstream media treats certain politicians. So, for example, Donald Trump is always whining about how the media hates him and the media is unfair to him. And he didn't go to the famous White House Correspondents' Dinner. He has a lot of press conferences, but he's obviously in those conversations in those interactions with the journalists, he's obviously very annoyed and gets very petulant when you ask him certain questions. I'm willing to say that many in the mainstream media did have or do have a bias against Donald Trump. I think that I think that's true in the sense that Donald Trump just drives many liberals around the bend and makes them kind of lose their senses at some level, and that's trickled into the media. I think, generally speaking, people in the media are more left leaning. So that I'm not gonna say there is no basis, I guess, to Trump's charge or Trump's accusations. And then you look at the treatment of former presidents. So because Donald Trump is now the evil man, or because he is the president that um, the liberals in the media don't want, they suddenly have very rosy. They're suddenly putting on their rose-colored glasses when it comes to former Republican presidents, and then so basically you have people in the mainstream media saying, "Well, I didn't like George Bush, but at least he wasn't Donald Trump." And then, of course, I would say the media has a pretty flowery view of Obama as well. And I think this derives from another part of the thought process that goes into mainstream media. They're looking for a sense of respectability, a sense of decorum. And Trump just doesn't have that decorum, and he doesn't act respectably. But you could say, well, Trump and Obama did similar things as president, but only Trump gets the blame for it. That's not to say that Trump and Obama. I would say Trump. I'm not saying that Trump and Obama are therefore one and the same. But I think there's a certain kind of moralism in the media, which is not warranted. But at the same time, you could say that there's also a lack of morality. So I guess to kind of put this rant in a tweet length statement, the mainstream media is excessively moralistic when it shouldn't be, and then it's not moralistic when it should be. Because Obama might be respectable, but he got us in 8 wars. The drone strike program was horrible. I don't hear the mainstream media covering that. So that's kind of another aspect of this whole conversation.
Yeah, I think I don't think I disagree with you really on that front. It is interesting because a lot of the news anchors seem fairly genuine in what they believe, yet they often flip on issues that you could easily argue they're doing for short-term political gain, right? So deciding that George Bush is okay now and we should treat him endorsing Biden once the results came in and Trump wouldn't concede. It's like, oh, but look, the George W. Bush Center or whatever sent their congratulations to Biden. It's like, we care what George Bush thinks because he's on our team now. Isn't Trump evil? And it's like, yeah, it's a farce. But I guess this is why it comes down to I'm fine as a informed observer saying, look how clearly they contradict themselves. So you shouldn't use them as an authoritative figure. And I think that the biggest problem is these neoliberal outlets that do things that are partisan for short-term gain are treated like they're authoritative. It's almost like you could cite CNN in a conversation and people, some people at the left would think that that's valid inherently, without doing their due diligence and confirming whatever is the source of what CNN said. And that's really just not the case. I mean, some of what they report is probably true, but you have to acknowledge that they clearly have their preferences and their goals. Now, I think the other thing I wanted to try to squeeze into this episode from that interview is how Jon Stewart mentioned the 24-hour news cycle. And I think this is my favorite point he mentioned, because it's why I actively hate news for the most part. And it's because every day there has to be a story. And I think the overwhelming amount of stories that are hyped up and you'll see causing something to trend on Twitter are generally noise, and they have almost no value in terms of other than it being a thing to argue about for the one day online. There's generally no value in hearing about it. You'll forget about it in 2 weeks. It's not going to advance any issue, and it's not going to play in the effect of any policy. It's just fodder for people to argue about on TV or on Twitter. So like anytime you hear a story where it's like, this might be a bad example, but like Don Jr., I think, got tested positive for coronavirus. And it's a headline that Politico can post. And then a bunch of people on Twitter are like, see, that's what you get for thinking it's a hoax. And then people are like, oh, and even Don Jr. got coronavirus. And it's like, wow, this is some, and John Jr. is a young guy who's healthy and will overwhelmingly likely that he will come out of this completely fine in like a week, right? And it's not even stated if he has symptoms. He just tested positive. So it's like, well, what does that even mean? So it's not used as like an example to have like a conversation about something substantive. It's just like, look, a Republican got coronavirus. We can, a bunch of people can overreact about it. And then people on the right can go, wow, it's so weird how the left is glorifying somebody being sick on the right. Aren't they heartless? And it's just fodder. And it's just fodder for people to be partisans. That's what I think is the result of the 24-hour cycle. And I think that's why news is just so baseless or useless a lot of the time. So how do you feel about what Jon Stewart said, and then my commentary on Jon Stewart's thoughts?
So I kind of want to, in this point in the conversation, begin to think a little bit about why the media is the way it is, or what are the what has led the media to be the media that we know. Jon Stewart would say the media is sensational. He says it's conflict oriented. He says it is perpetuating differences that truly don't exist. And an easy example of like sensationalism and the media being conflict oriented goes back to Donald Trump. So a few minutes ago, I just acknowledged that I think Trump has there is some anti-Trump bias in the media. I think you can also blame the media at some level for Trump's election. And why is that? I blame the media because there were people around 2016 who said, Trump's good for ratings. Keep talking about Trump. And because Trump is just a crazy person at some level, it's like, oh, here's a crazy person running for president. Here's what he's saying. We're going to talk about this for an hour. So it's like, okay, the media has some bias against Trump, but they also helped get him elected in the first place. And I guess I bring that up to springboard the conversation of why does the media function as it does. The 24-hour news cycle, I suppose, is a part of that, in the sense that certain people got the idea in their heads that that people need constant stimulation. That they need constant. They need to be fed information about news and politics and culture constantly, and so I guess what I'm trying to get at is a definite distinction between you and I. I think, I guess one reason I wanted to talk about the media was because, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I take your issue with the media is almost is similar to your issue with democracy, in the sense that this represents at some level mob opinion or the majority opinion, or at least the sensationalism or the conflict, the media being conflict oriented stems from just the flaws within human nature. And so in other words, you can't. I think you would say you can't blame the elites for having sensational media, because people want sensational media because people are sensational. And I think Jon Stewart would probably disagree with that, and I think I would disagree with that. I think people are more reasonable than is sometimes suggested, and I think I don't think this the current media landscape is necessarily or it necessarily comes from the flaw with the common person. How do you feel about any of what I just said?
Yeah, so I take your point. I don't know if I don't think it's an accurate evaluation of why I think the news is a problem when it's contingent with democracy. So I don't think news, like partisanship and bias, is the news. I don't think news can be as bad as it is because that's what people want. Because I mean, in the last like 5 years, we've seen so much, decreases in ratings across all the, corporate media into more alternative sources. And it's because people don't really like the corporate media stuff, right? People would rather listen to Ben Shapiro cut an hour-long op-ed than listen to what is supposedly objective journalism from like CNN or Bloomberg. So it's people are shifting to things that they feel better suit their needs. I don't think that's a problem, and I see people shifting from the sensationalism to some extent, but then you go on Twitter and everybody is sensationalizing. My example before of Don Jr., getting coronavirus. So part of it, some people like point scoring. Some people are partisans and they want to point score on their opponents, and then they see that the big story of the day is, look, Donald Trump Jr. has coronavirus, I'm going to go score points and then laugh at people who I'm going to allege have viewpoints I disagree with. And it's like, okay, that's fine. There are people like that, and that's okay. My issue, my biggest issue with the news is the general neoliberal worldview being shoehorned into everything, and how authoritative it's viewed by the public, even though the average person doesn't know enough about the basic foundations and assumptions neoliberals make to properly evaluate if they agree with the neoliberal worldview. So, and the example I give, I guess I could give off the top of my head, is imagine that there's a policy that somebody hears about and their intuition is to think it's good, and then whatever reporting site they read, oh, the Congressional Budget Office scores this policy as being revenue neutral over 5 years. And it's like, and I apologize for the cat in the background. But it's like, okay, that sounds like information that doesn't sound particularly biased. But it's like, okay, but the average person reading that, if they already agree with the policy, don't know anything historically about anything the Congressional Budget Office does. And if you click on like a hyperlink, it might be like, oh, they're a nonpartisan group. Okay, well, what does that really mean? Well, nonpartisan generally means they'd use a bunch of basic Keynesian assumptions in their models. Well, it's like, well, do you agree with economic Keynesian, the validity of economic Keynesian, of like the arguments that underlie that economic philosophy? And it's like, well, maybe not. It's like people don't know because people don't know much about economics. So it's like, well, I feel like I'm informed now because I read an article that seemed unbiased and it told me the CBO thinks something. But it's like, it gives you the facade of knowing things you don't know. So I think people believe, especially if they consume a lot of news, that they're more informed than they are, instead of knowing that in the end, we're probably all fools because every field of policy is so niche that, and economics can be complex, or it's just so heated in terms of if you actually look at the underlying assumptions, that it's like, well, unless you fleshed out a ton of other things, I don't really think you can even be informed. But the news can give you a facade of being informed. That's why the people I universally tend to dislike the most are the people who listen to NPR and think they know things about politics. I think those are like the lowest form of humans in like a really messed up way. I guess I could say that in terms of like having conversations about politics, because they see NPR as authoritative source because it attempts to be nonpartisan to some extent. So then they walk away from listening to NPR, a couple times a week, thinking that they have a good view of all the issues. And it's like, you don't, because everything that an NPR tells you is authoritative is based on what the neoliberal worldview thinks is authoritative. And that might not be true, and you don't know it. So you're just operating on an appeal to authority that you've never thought about. That's my problem with the news. And the other thing I would say is there isn't a good reason to know all those things that I brought up. There's no reason for a person to be motivated enough to look into all these things that I've noted unless they weirdly had the hobby of doing it, as opposed to just being a citizen who exists and is like, well, maybe I should listen to some stuff. See, if you only listen to some stuff, you're at best going to have the facade of being informed based on taking people's words as true and authoritative when they probably aren't, or maybe not. That's my real problem. So I think a lot of what they say isn't legitimate and it's treated as legitimate. I don't think it's because people are stupid. It's just like, why would somebody? And plenty of smart people are used as the authoritative sources, but smart people are wrong all the time, which is why there's Nobel Prize winners who directly conflict with other Nobel Prize winners. So how can you expect a random person on the street to evaluate this? And it's like, you can't. So even if they take in a bunch of news, it's like they're not going to be informed. That's and I comfortably stand there, and I know you disagree, but that's just the conclusion I've come to, because I used to be a person who listened to NPR and thought I was informed because of it, and I wasn't at all.
So in my head, I attributed to you a conservative talking point, which I think you might have said something similar like months ago. I don't remember exactly what you said, but I'm glad to hear your opinion is far more nuanced than I gave you credit for. So sorry about that. But I guess when we're talking about issues with the media, I don't want to. I think some people do chalk it up to, well, people are stupid and they're going to watch stupid stuff, and therefore the news is stupid. I think that's a very lazy argument that I often do hear people make. I think the issues of the media are far more about neoliberals wanting everyone to be to go along with neoliberalism. So that really, I guess, is like the overarching my overarching critique of the media. And I think because that's my overarching critique of the media, I think the media could be run very differently. You know, it's funny, you mentioned earlier how people view the New York Times as an authoritative source, and they shouldn't. But I think we can the media can be crafted in such a way as to warrant being an authoritative, finding authoritative sources out there. But I just don't think that the current media landscape has many authoritative sources. But I think the golden rule of journalism is that I should be able to trust that the journalists know what they're doing to some extent, or are going to be honest with me to a certain extent, despite their biases. And I just don't have that. I don't think journalists on average are doing that, especially journalists in the mainstream media. And that upsets me.
And to take it back to I guess the opinion you potentially ascribed to me before this conversation, in somewhat defense of that position, I will say, as accessible as this podcast is on several podcasts, on several podcatchers, you can just as easily spend the hour listening to a Cato Institute event where an expert talks on some esoteric policy. So sometimes they have broad conversations or more interesting ones, but like Brookings Institute, Cato, all these like think tanks bring in academic people to talk on issues for hours all the time. And they definitely are not popular podcasts by any standard. If you tried to find the most popular one, and you compared it to like a middle like Pod Save America or something much smaller than Pod Save America, even, it's still probably like powers lower in terms of viewership. And it's kind of inevitable because it's not that fun to learn about a random esoteric policy when you could listen to a YouTuber talk about something for an hour. It's probably way more entertaining too. And since it's something that's people use to listen to for entertainment or to put on in the background, you want it to have some level of entertainment. And watching presentations is never going to be that. But if you want to get beyond talking points, haha, you kind of have to expose yourself to that stuff every now and then, and it's just not fun for the average person. So to some extent, I am blaming people for being stupid rubes because, like, oh, you don't want to listen to a 2 hour long lecture about monetary policy and and why it's important to do certain monetary policy things, or like why stimulus can be counterproductive, but the measurements people use will show it being productive even if it's not actually better for people. It's like, oh, yeah, we can argue about what GDP means and if it's a good metric and why stimulus will inflate it, even if it actually has a negative effect on 8 other metrics. It's like that's conversation, but you're not going to hear that on like Fox or Bloomberg. You're going to hear that when you watch like a Cato Institute lecture that's point by point, and people aren't going to watch Cato Institute lectures point by point. So it is a little bit of of that point, but I think there's a better nuanced argument of that point that I don't even fully hold. But I would be like okay defending that point. It's like there's a reason why people don't listen to policy podcasts, but they listen to comedy politics podcasts like Jimmy Dore. And it's not to say Jimmy Dore has no substance. I find him entertaining and he has things that are delightful to say sometimes, but you can't compare him to, in terms of the rigor, you can't compare him to like a bunch of experts on a panel. And a lot of those experts could be totally wrong, but it's just a different kind of information. And I know we're running long, so I'll let you get the last word in before we wrap up.
Okay, in terms of what I ascribe to you, I'm gonna put that in the half right category. Half right. I was half right. I'll take it. But I guess to give my like closing statements, the reason I sent you the link to this conversation was basically because it was between Rachel Maddow, who was because it's her job, she was defending MSNBC and saying, no, John, you don't understand. Or basically what Jon Stewart was saying is, at some level, MSNBC is imitating Fox. He does say he doesn't think they're exactly the same, and he thinks Fox is a special case. But he was saying, MSNBC is basically like, diet Fox News or Fox News light, or in a liberal, in a left wing direction, of course. And Rachel Maddow was saying, well, no, John, we are objective journalists. We're doing what we should be doing. It's not fair to compare us to Fox News, and you're not. You're not giving us enough credit. And I think I completely agree with Jon Stewart in that part of the conversation. It was, if any part of the conversation was cringy, it was the times when Rachel Maddow was forced to defend the network that she works for. And I would probably go along with what Jon Stewart said about Fox News and MSNBC not necessarily being one and the same, but I do think I think their business models are quite similar, and that is why I dislike both of them immensely. I watch a fair bit of mainstream news from the mainstream media, but I watch it fully aware that of the narrative that is that people are attempting to persuade me of or convince me of, and at some level I am I'm willing to say that Fox News and MSNBC are just two like interpretations of that overall narrative, or two slight variations of that overall narrative. So so at the end of the day, that was really why it piques my interest and why I've watched it several times. I like the fact that Jon Stewart is willing to have these conversations with these people on these networks and call them out and say, you're not doing what you think you're doing, or you should probably do something a little different if you want to think of yourself as this investigative journalist, or as this person who's really putting their money where their mouth is and is really guided by some moral compass, then you really need to think about what you are associating with, what you are a part of, and perhaps fight to change the media landscape and change journalism as a profession.
So if you guys enjoyed this episode, feel free to leave us a review or a rating. You can find us on all podcatchers, so like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. And you can listen to us there. You can find us on YouTube by searching The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points. That's the account that Matt has been uploading the episodes under. And then you can see our faces as we argue, and you can see how overgrown my beard is getting. And you could also casually notice when we record it by seeing that I'm wearing a coat in some episodes, even though I'm inside and I'm just too cheap to turn that heat up higher. So you can enjoy all that fun stuff if you watch the YouTube version. Other than that, we're going to have more fun arguing about stuff next week, and I hope you guys enjoyed. So signing off, it's Matt.